Yeah, it's really interesting. Whenever I speak to theists, and just to be clear, I'm not a theist myself, but whenever I do speak to theists about secularism or humanism or these sorts of things, they kind of begin to argue that it's almost like a sort of extrapolation of Christianity, with God just kind of supplanted for something else, whether that be human flourishing or world flourishing or whatever language they want to like, or humanists or whoever want to add in to kind of give them their sticking point. How do you kind of begin to explain or speak about secularism? Like, would you ever go as far as to say it is just a sort of extension of Christianity and it comes from Christian principles? And if you don't do that, I'd be really interested to kind of hear how you would respond to a theist who would be kind of almost hammering that point home, right? It's really difficult, I think, sometimes to break that connection. So I don't know what your thoughts on that space, Phil.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing. Okay, so one quick anecdote, and then I'm going to go directly to your question. And if I
Sure.
stray, just bring me back. When I first started doing my interviews in Scandinavia and having in-depth interviews with people, I would ask them, well, are you a Christian? And they would say yes, like without thinking, like, of course I'm a Christian. And if I said to them, well, what does that mean to you? They might say something like, well, that's just what we Danes are. So they might just say, well, we're Lutheran here in Denmark or Sweden. So it was just a kind of identity marker, maybe even an ethnicity marker in the face of immigrants who tended to be Muslim. Or they would say, well, to me, Phil, being a Christian means being kind to others, taking care of the sick, the hungry, the homeless, taking care of those in need, and I would be like, uh-huh. And then I'd say, but do you believe that Jesus is your personal savior? And they'd sort of like, even that language makes them feel a little uncomfortable. They're like, we don't talk, no. And I would say, like, do you believe Jesus died for you? And they'd be like, no. Do you believe that Jesus is God? No. I mean, none of the core, so I would say, oh, you're actually when you say like we need to be kind to others, take care of the sick. I mean, to me, that's just straight up secular humanism or social democracy. But they identify it as Christian, which is really interesting to me. And even more interesting, when I came back to the States, if I told this to strong Christians, pastors, they would shake their heads too. They'd say, that's not Christian. I would say to them, this is what they were just as much saying they weren't real Christians as I was. They were like, no, no, no. If you don't, you take Jesus out of there. Okay, so now to your question. Does it come from Christianity? Yes and no. And let me tell you what I mean by that. A lot of Christians or Americans, or I don't know what it's like in the UK, like they sort of think history started with Christianity. Christianity is a very late comer. I mean, right now I'm currently reading ethics in ancient Chinese philosophy with Confucius and Mencius. Like, this is way before Christianity. Civilization existed for a long time before the Christian scriptures were written. Philosophy had bloomed, Judaism had bloomed, Zoroastrianism bloomed. Buddha, no, not Buddha. What we now call Hinduism. I mean, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy. People were living in bands of groups for hundreds of thousands of years. So what I would argue is all religions are human-made. I don't believe they come down from the sky. So all religions are human attempts to codify or put into story form the previous civilizations' ethics, morals, explanations, rules, laws. And it's done everywhere. The people in, the ancient Incans did it. The ancient Aztecs did it. Every ancient people in Africa, in wherever, in Australia, they all told stories about where do they come from, how you ought to behave, what kind of rituals to perform, and so on and so forth. So at some point, Christianity comes along. I think it's definitely an improvement from like Hammurabi's code. You read Hammurabi's code, it's like, well, if someone kills your daughter, you can kill their daughter. Not very good. Then you get to Judaism, and there's, an eye for an eye, and love your enemy, love your neighbor. Then you get to Christianity, and it's even more, I think that you can see the evolution of human morality I think in a positive direction. So by the time we get to Jesus's sayings in the Gospels, you have again these moral codes. They're wonderful. They're nonviolent. They're share and share alike, live by the sword, die. It's communistic, kind of feed the sick. And people say to Jesus, what do I have to do to be a follower? And he said, give everything you have to the poor. I mean, it's a very So that to me comes out of human experience. It's not that Christianity gave that to humanity. It's that humanity had that in its heart, in its bones, in its DNA, in its evolutionary history. And at some point it got put into a story and written down. So if people say to me, well, isn't Scandinavia just kind of living out these Christian values? I would say yes. And they're doing it in a way that's better than highly Christian nations. But the source of it is not Christianity. The source of it is our human empathy, which predates Christianity. It comes from our bioevolutionary past, and it just got codified at a certain point. And I would say our moral improvement didn't stop at Christianity. Read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's far superior to anything Jesus had to articulate, or Paul. So we're always advancing in terms of making the world a more just and fair place. So but that's a mouthful to try to explain to a Christian. It didn't start with Christianity. I guess you just have to say that and let their brains let that sink in. But I'm also willing to say, oh yeah, there's a lot that's great in Christianity that has been implemented, and there's no question Christian culture centuries of Christian culture affected Scandinavia, just like centuries of Buddhism have influenced China and Japan or Thailand. And there's wonderful things in Buddhism that don't start with Buddhism. They start with earlier human experience, but they get articulated in Buddhist stories. Great. I don't know if that made any sense, but that's what I try to do. And then I might say to them, well, isn't it interesting then that those Christian principles that you value so much are most successfully implemented in what I would say largely post-Christian societies. So what I try to say to them is okay, then maybe we should all be advocating for a kind of post-Christendom, because if you look at where society is still quite Christian, and by that I mean strong belief in a God, strong belief in Jesus, high levels of prayer, high levels of church attendance, the wet dream of Mike Johnson, the wet dream of Mike Pence, how are those societies doing? Not so great. It's not just because they're Christian. I'm not making that argument. But the Christianity doesn't seem to be helping them to the degree that a post-Christian society is. And I also don't, I'm also not saying these societies are flawless. I know Scotland Scotland is one of the most non-religious societies on earth. It's one of the least religious in the UK. Aberdeenshire is the least religious county in all the UK. I'm not saying that there aren't problems in Aberdeenshire. Of course there's drug problems and crime problems and depression and but those problems are not nearly as acute as they are in other societies, which is why Scottish people aren't lining up and waiting for years to migrate to Nigeria or Senegal, but it is the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, I was really kind of woken up to this when I began to actually read Plato for myself, kind of getting into the sort of the idea of the world of the forms. And at the very, very end of the Republic, kind of Plato talks about these souls kind of going through almost like a sort of purgatory stage if they've lived a negative life, and if they've lived a positive life, going to some sort of reward, and then coming back to this middle place, drinking this liquid which will make them forget everything, and then becoming reincarnated back into the world, and then having to live again, and then depending on how they did, either go up or down and stuff. It's really interesting because you kind of begin to from that see this idea, which you also see develop throughout the scriptures, which is this idea of kind of recompense for the wrongs or the justices done on this life. If I lived a good life, I should be rewarded. If somebody lived a bad life and killed me and they're going to get away with it, there needs to be time in the afterlife for them to pay their dues for the evil they've done. And this idea gets extrapolated. So it's fascinating, basically, watching Plato influence the Gospels even. Something like John, the Gospel of John talks about the Logos, the sort of first kind of 16-ish verses of chapter 1 of John, the Gospel. It's very, very heavily influenced by kind of the classic Greek understanding of Logos. It's just mind blowing. And what I think is really, really interesting. If you enjoyed this clip, head on over to Locals to watch the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can freely listen to the audio-only version of the conversation. If you're on YouTube or Rumble, please like, subscribe, and then hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a new episode. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.